Hello, I'm Dr. Emily Watkins, and I'm an environmental physiologist at the University of Roehampton in the UK. Thank you very much for inviting me to join your conference. I've been working with the Fire and Rescue Service over here for around the last 8 to 9 years now, and we're starting to now focus on questions specific to do with female firefighters. So my presentation today is going to focus on our research looking at the impact of the menstrual cycle on heat tolerance. So as I'm sure you're all aware, when we put an individual in a firefighting situation, the combination of their personal protective equipment, their physical demands of the task, and also the environmental temperatures leads to a scenario where they have increases in core body temperature and also a risk of a heat illness occurring. Now, heat illnesses range from quite mild heat cramps to perhaps a more severe heat exhaustion and heat stroke. Now, these are not only detrimental to an individual's ability to do their job, but also detrimental to their health and potentially fatal as well. And when we look in the literature, there are a range of factors that are commonly suggested to be associated with an increased risk of heat illness. And one of those that is quite often mentioned is to do with sex. So females are considered to be more at risk of a heat illness than males are. Now, there are a range of factors to do with this and why this might be the case, but the one that we're going to think about and focus on today is the menstrual cycle. So this graph here takes us through the changes in the menstrual cycle, and we can see here that individuals start off in the follicular phase through days 1 to 14, followed by ovulation and then the luteal phase occurring after ovulation through to then around day 28. Estrogen, which is predominantly released from our ovarian cells, is the main hormone that occurs at the very beginning, and it increases to a peak before ovulation and then remains elevated throughout our luteal phase. Through our follicular phase, our progesterone levels are quite low, and these increase following ovulation in the luteal phase. Now, these hormones are both associated with core temperature. So estrogen is suggested to be related to reducing body temperature as it lowers the temperature threshold for sweating and cutaneous vasodilation. Progesterone works in the opposite way, so increasing core temperature because it increases those thresholds. So theoretically, if our core temperature changes throughout our menstrual cycle and is elevated in our luteal phase, it may mean that individuals are less tolerant to the heat in that phase of the menstrual cycle. If we take a look at some other research that's looked at this particular area, we see a study from 1999 that looked at 90 minutes of physical exercise and how those individuals coped in their different phases. And they found that very clearly those in the luteal phase had an increased core temperature, and this continued throughout exercise. A more recent study by Notley et al. In 2019 finds a different answer. So they reported that although core body temperature increased with different exercise intensities, those in different phases, there was no difference between them. So it didn't matter what phase you're in to what your core body temperature was. So we wanted to look at this from a slightly more applied perspective. So rather than 90 minutes of exercise, a bit more specific to perhaps the duration or the breathing apparatus. And rather than exercising in, say, shorts and t-shirts and kind of moderate heat, exercising in something slightly more similar to a firefighting scenario. So our aim of the study was to investigate the heat tolerance of females at different stages of their menstrual cycle. And we've done this by recruiting 16 females to our study, and they all have regular menstrual cycles and are not using any form of hormone contraceptive. So thinking then about our study design and what we actually got these women to do, they came to our laboratories and they wore PPE for the whole of the study, and they also exercised in our heat chamber set at 50 degrees Celsius. We took a range of measurements, as you can see here on the screen, and I'll just go through when we collected those. So when they first arrived, we collected new body mass and also checked that they were in a hydrated state. They then rested for 10 minutes and then they entered our heat chamber. So after our 10 minutes rest, they go into our chamber set at 50 degrees. For the first 15 minutes of the test, the speed was altered very slightly every 5 minutes to calculate their metabolic heat production. So they had a gas mask on the whole time for us to work that out. After we'd established at what speed they needed to be walking to be working at 6 watts per kilogram heat production, they then continued at that speed for 25 minutes. At no point was our individual running, they were all walking, but it ranged from around 4.5 to just above 6 kilometers per hour. So there were 5-minute intervals at the beginning there. We collected some physiological and perceptual measures at the beginning, so core temperature, heart rate, skin temperature, RPE, thermal sensation, and heat illness symptoms. And then we collected those physiological measures every 5 minutes. We also collected those perceptual measures every 10 minutes as well. And when they exited the chamber at the end, we collected nude body mass from them again so that we could work out their sweat rate. So if we now have a little look through some of that data, so this is their core temperature response throughout the test, and you can see here their follicular and their luteal phases. So their follicular phases are coloured in black circles, their luteal phase, those open circles with the dashed line. And from having a little look at that graph, perhaps the luteal phase has slightly higher core temperatures, but that actually our standard deviations on there are quite large. And if we look from a statistically significant point of view, we get no significant difference. So at the end there of our test, our follicular individuals, their follicular phases, core temperature was around 38.8 degrees Celsius, whilst luteal was around 38.84. So a 0.04 degree difference and no statistical difference. If we then look at one of our perceptual measures, so here we've got RPE, we see RPE increases as the study goes on in duration. We end up at around 15 on our RPE scale, but again, no statistical differences between those two phases. We can also have a look at sweat rates. Remember those changes in sweat thresholds in terms of temperature thresholds that are suggested with changes in hormones. But here we see our follicular and our luteal phase are quite similar. Our follicular stage phase has got 1.08 litres per hour in terms of sweat rate, and our luteal just below 1 at 0.96 litres per hour. And again, no statistical difference in our sweat rate. It might be quite interesting to point out here that we've run this protocol with male participants as well, and our males typically get around 1.4 litres per hour in sweat rate. So definitely a lower sweat rate in our female firefighters, but no difference between those menstrual cycle phases. Now, when people typically look at heat tolerance in research, often they dichotomize data and think of individuals as either being tolerant or not tolerant. From a perspective of a firefighter and a much more applied perspective, we perhaps don't need to dichotomize so much, but think of it more as a continuum that people can move up and down on depending on interventions and kind of fitness and changes that they make. So here I've put together a continuum looking at kind of putting it in colour sections. So towards the far kind of left end, we've got this green zone up to around 38 degrees Celsius. And then we've got an amber section in the middle up to around 38.5. And then red up towards the further end of our test there, 39.2. Perhaps we could actually extend our amber zone up to 39. Over here, that's typically the temperature that they're interested in terms of kind of being at risk or wanting to take someone out of a fire if you're able to measure it in a training scenario. Okay, so if we have a look at our data here, again, follicular coloured in circles, we can see that luteal circles perhaps slightly further up, but actually everyone is in those same zones. And in fact, there was only one individual that changed from our amber into our red zone. So everyone essentially staying where they are between those phases. So overall, we set out to investigate our heat tolerance of females at different stages of our menstrual cycles, and we can conclude that there was no significant difference in heat tolerance between those two different phases. Whilst changes might be slightly different, whilst there's a little bit of perhaps increase from one phase to another, there's such variation and those changes are perhaps so small that there's not a statistically significant difference. And thinking perhaps from an applied setting, not something that we perhaps need to be quite so concerned about. I've included this as a bit of an extra because I thought it might be of interest to some of you. And we've also collected data in this protocol from male participants, and I thought it might be nice to have a little bit of a look at that too. So I've got some instructors on here who show heat adaptation, and you can clearly see that they are further down on that continuum. But if we look at a control group of males, we can actually see that there are perhaps some males that cope worse in the heat than our female participants did. And so really it might be worth us considering that menstrual cycle phases isn't the be-all and end-all in terms of heat tolerance, and really there are other factors that are more important, and perhaps it isn't quite as simple as females being worse in the heat than males. And so what next? We are looking at this in terms of the impact of oral contraception and the impact that the menopause will have. So similar study design, but slightly different aspects here. And we're collecting data for that at the moment. And then we are also looking at maternal and gynecological health. And this is the focus that we'd like to be moving into at the moment. And we're hoping to begin working with some of you on projects related to this. So thank you very much for having me to this conference. I'm more than happy to answer any questions. My contact details are on the screen there. Thank you very much.